Picture, if you will, a serene morning in Victorian England, where the cobblestones might still be damp from last night's rain, or perhaps the dew just decided to add its own touch of shimmer. As the sun barely peeks over the horizon, real work is already humming along in bustling factories and sooty streets, but not in the grand estates. No, inside one particular abode adorned with lace and a heavy pungency of lavender sat Anne, a woman of considerable class and, well, considerable boredom. The rich Victorian woman, dear listener, did not rise with the sun. She, instead, embraced the gentle approach of a leisurely awakening marked by the distant chime of the breakfast bell. Pulling the covers tighter, Anne lazed a moment longer in the kind of opulent languor that most people only experience on those magical holiday mornings. Her day would commence not with high-pressure meetings, but instead a luxurious appointment with Mrs. Thistlebottom, the housekeeper who insured Anne's biggest morning task would be selecting between the silver or gold crockery for breakfast, a daunting decision to be sure. Enter the dressing room, a chamber padded with gossamer and dresses that seemed to sigh with a life of their own. Here awaited a lady's maid, an almost mystical creature capable of transforming bedhead into an artwork worthy of its own oil portrait. Anne would glance sleepily into the mirror, practicing the demeanor of a woman resigned to the valiant struggle of appearing nonchalantly chic. Her wardrobe was less about choice and more about adhering to strict societal codes that dictated which ensemble of lace, brocade, and boning one might endure merely to have tea, while simultaneously gossiping about the neighbor's unfortunate chimney sweep incident. Fully arrayed like a moving, talking floral arrangement, Anne delicately wafted her way to breakfast. Porridge was served, not because anyone particularly enjoyed it, but because it was tradition. And in Victorian England, tradition was just as binding as gravity. The key was to eat elegantly, dodging those fiendish lumps of oats with poise only rivaled by a cat navigating a bathtub. Post-breakfast called for the garden walk, a social event disguised as exercise. Imagine, if you will, strolling arm in arm with fellow socialites who concealed their rigorous debates over lunch menus with the soft rattle of beaded lace gloves. Conversations drifted like the pollen in the air, mostly inconsequential and delightfully pompous, much like the antics of Queen Victoria's less enviable relations. The afternoon brought opportunities for the society of letters. Anne would pretend to craft correspondences by scratching a feathered pen on exquisite parchment. Never mind the fact that the ink was as real as your chances of hailing a cab in a British downpour. The letters were pre-written by a beleaguered assistant wielding a slightly more affordable quill. As the light began its retreat, the parlor beckoned with yet another meeting where card games of incredible complexity were played. Anne could never remember whether the aim was to win or lose, nor indeed could her fellow players, whose strategies relied heavily on the volume of tea consumed rather than any discernible skill. And thus our sweet Anne tiptoed toward her evening, much like her mid-morning and afternoon, adorned in a soft cloud of unattainable leisure. A genteel theatre performance awaited the night, the greatest performance of those attending pretending to stay awake. And dear listener, if these tales have helped your eyes grow heavy and your mind find its own dreamland intrigues, please subscribe to the channel, your quiet applause in the digital auditorium. Before your last sleepy thoughts drift into storyland, let me know where you're listening from and what time the Sandman shows up at your door. Dream sweetly, history's gentle whisper just beginning to fade in your ear. Imagine, if you will, floating somewhere over the cobblestone streets of Victorian London, drifting gently past street lamps that flicker with gaslight and releasing the sweet aroma of adventure and coal into the misty night air. Now, sail your way into an extravagant townhouse, its windows aglow with shadows moving behind damask curtains. Here, we find Lady Penelope Sinclair, dressed to the nines in lace and pearls, at the very pinnacle of the social ladder, or perhaps more accurately, the social hairpin. For the Victorian woman of leisure, her daily duties could be summed up with one main task: not falling off her plinth of superiority. Morning for Lady Penelope begins, not with the screech of an alarm clock or a frantic dash to work, but with the gentle wake-up call of birds chirping irresponsibly close to her window, hired specially to ensure harmony in all aspects of her life. Rising from a quilted bed that more closely resembles a marshmallow fortress, she is greeted by her lady's maid who comes armed with a cup of the finest Darjeeling tea and whispers of a bath already drawn. Bathing in the Victorian era was not the frantic 10-minute splash and dash we modern folk might recognize. Oh no, it was an elaborate symphony of oils and delicate scents. In fact, the lavishness of one's bath was often equaled by the elaborateness of one's hair, which, much like Lady Penelope's, seemed to defy gravity and all reasonable architecture, with a series of curls and contraptions that could likely double as a birdcage. Post-bath activities included several hours in front of a vanity larger than some current-day studio apartments. Here, Lady Penelope would peruse through her collection of complexion aids. Contrary to popular belief, Victorian women didn't shy away from makeup. Instead, they indulged in concoctions that promised them the creamy pallor of a ghost with a high social standing. Lead and arsenic made rather unfortunate cameos in these powders, yet the promise of fair skin often triumphed over any reservations about poisoning oneself. With the complexion of a delicate apparition and the coiffure to rival a cathedral spire, she elegantly descends for breakfast, typically consisting of toast that you're meant to nibble, lest you reveal gastronomic enthusiasm unbecoming of a lady, and eggs that must be consumed with a strict adherence to etiquette, as set out by her trio of etiquette books. It was all very egg-citing. After breakfast, Lady Penelope embarks on a flurry of needlework, a delightful euphemism for hours of embroidering scenes that would ultimately be used to enhance any number of unnecessarily frilly tea cozies. Needlework was not merely an activity, but an art form, a pastime requiring great skill, or at least a great tolerance for endlessly poking oneself with sharp objects while dreaming of more exciting adventures. It served as meditation, relaxation, and conveniently, an activity that allowed her to sit by the window with a strategically placed mirror to observe the comings and goings of Mrs. Everett, 2 houses down, whose bonnet was questionable. As midday approaches, Lady Penelope prepares for her promenade, this daily outing around the local park, accompanied by either a generic, small dog with a personality or a hired companion, depending on which one was better behaved, was a way to see and be seen, to strut one's fashionable wares like a human peacock deploying a social strategy. Each step down the gravel path was a reminder to everyone else that her shoes were perhaps more expensive than they were comfortable, which is a price worth paying in the name of prestige. The day gently drifts into the afternoon when Lady Penelope retreats to her sitting room for visiting hours. Calling cards, exchanged like currency, dictated a social dance of who could come and go, and ensure you remained high on the social RSVP list. Always prepared with witty banter and a strategically slow pour of tea to stretch. Meetings to suitably genteel lengths, Lady Penelope adeptly navigates conversations that live on a merry-go-round of compliments and subtle insults, each one exquisitely delivered with a gracious smile. As evening beckons, the allure of the dinner table calls, another opportunity to demonstrate one's ability to balance grace and gastronomy, each course complemented by strategic bon mots and exclamations that tread the line between scandal and delight. The night draws in, and so ends another day in the life of a Victorian lady of leisure, each moment woven with a mix of charm and challenge. Tomorrow, perhaps, will reveal further adventures in the world of high society and manually operated crinoline configurations. But for now, we shall gently float away, like the mist over London. On this particularly breezy Victorian morning, imagine, if you will, the delicate rustle of crinoline skirts as the languid sun shyly peeks through the heavy silk drapes of a genteel drawing room. Here, nestled amidst the cacophony of polished mahogany furniture and floral brocade, the life of the well-to-do Victorian lady unfurls with languorous elegance. Our Lady of Leisure begins her day not with a hurried alarm, but with the gentle nudge of a silver-braided servant announcing the morning post. Alas, this correspondence is no mere collection of trivial notifications, but a bundle of vibrant, gilt-edged letters. They are sealed with the most colorful array of family crests, evoking a feeling akin to opening the most decadent of candy boxes. Each letter, a potential clandestine rendezvous, or rather scandalous invitation to a tea-stained affair, is opened with the precision and grace of a surgeon. And let's just say that Victorian mail could cut much deeper than paper. After securing the day's social itinerary, morning ablutions are carried out in what can only be described as a ritual of perfumed potions and strange contraptions. One does not simply toss water on one's face. Certainly not. Warm water, politely boiled, is escorted in through porcelain jugs, alongside an array of soaps scented with the essence of far-flung continents, and possibly more than a hint of sandalwood and imperialism. Once properly lotioned, Our Lady embarks on the act of dressing, an event not to be mistaken for mere practicality. Selecting the day's wardrobe is like drafting military orders, each garment and accessory aimed at subverting or supporting the social maneuvering of the game, what's fashionably called society. Layers of cotton held together by an intricate lacework of corsets could make Napoleon's campaigns seem like casual picnics. It's a lovely paradox that women hid beneath mountains of fabric while claiming supremacy over hearts with the tiniest of coquettish gestures, an art form as delicate and complex as balancing a spoon on one's nose. And if you'd ever seen a Victorian day dress, you'd agree that sometimes spoons were indeed balanced on noses. Fashionably armed for the day, she might spend a charming hour in her morning room reading what can only be classified as Victorian clickbait, serial novels published in sensational installments. Long before streaming, these stories worked overtime to keep plush-covered seats at the edge. And make no mistake, the most Victorian of gentlewomen were known to clutch their pearls, involuntarily of course, at nothing more scandalous than the surprise return of her otherwise assumed dead protagonist. Having expended her literary energies, she might venture outside to promenade the finest of parks. But do not be misled by the gentle rhythm of her stroll or by the benign bob of her parasol. The grand parks of Victorian splendor were the stage upon which alliances were brokered and reputations danced the tightrope of public opinion. Strolling, a complex mix of gliding and floating, was a skill honed since infancy. Eyes were watchful beneath brimmed hats, exchanging discreet nods and far grander salutes than one dares in modern pedestrian pursuits. After successfully negotiating the minefield of potential faux pas and overzealous gaggles of pigeons, our noblewoman returns to a luncheon scene reminiscent of a naval command briefing, replete with the pivotal cutlery strategies and seafood negotiations. The afternoon, however, possesses its own tranquil charm as the tea-time ritual seeps through human schedules with the inevitability of Earl Grey steam. This sacred ceremony of leaf brewing becomes a waltz of chit-chat and clinking china, punctuated by the grandiloquent dilemma of crumpet versus scone. Here, amidst the gentle haze of gossip and brewing perfection, the day ebbs into a calming shroud, with just the faintest humdrum of a city drowsing under its own industriousness. As the sun nudges itself ever so politely to the horizon, allowing the moon to unfurl its silver gown, our Victorian lady surrenders the day with the gentle anticipation of the evening's diversions to follow. She readies herself for the evening's drawing room soiree, no doubt pondering what mischief or merriment awaits. And so, we drift onwards into the growing shadows, lulled by the promise of future escapades, under the forgiving eyes of flickering gas lamps and twinkling stars, as we gently sail through the serene, powdered sugar world of Victorian splendor. Let's pause a moment to imagine ourselves in an opulent boudoir, bedecked with lavish draperies and the soft rustle of silks. This, dear slumber-bound companion, is where a rich Victorian woman might begin her day, a little later than what you'd consider a commoner's sunrise. After all, being fabulously wealthy does come with its schedule perks. Mornings in all their leisurely glory would often commence with the indulgence of a breakfast in bed. While you conjure images of silver trays and fragrant teas, remember that the fashionable Victorian breakfast was no mere omelette affair. We are speaking of dishes like kedgeree, a curious marriage of haddock and rice infused with curry, and even the extravagant introduction of avocado, which, back then, was just as mystifying as it is on your sourdough toast today. These rituals, though grand, were also somewhat akin to morning art performances, where one could display both elegant posture and a dainty appetite. Once fortified by their gourmet repast, Victorian ladies often turned to the day's affairs, a fancy term for orchestrating the complex ballet of household staff. The butler, cook, housekeeper, and maid were discreet players in this grand domestic production. It was a lot like managing a Victorian Downton Abbey, minus the dramatic plot twists, or at least one hoped so. From issuing orders with the precision of a general, hair perfectly coiffed, of course, the lady of the house ensured every dust mote and doily comported itself with propriety. Replete with managerial tasks, our Victorian lady might retire for a little restorative reading. This was not just any reading. Theirs was a genteel affair involving classic literature or poignant poetry, meant to nourish one's intellectual vista. Of course, this was the era that produced a plethora of novels, and one could easily become lost in the pages of the latest Dickens, an author with a penchant for producing books longer than some transatlantic voyages. Following this cerebral interlude, it was time to dress for the day, which in itself was quite the undertaking. Dressing in the Victorian age was a group activity, requiring a lady's maid and at least 3 layers of clothing, not forgetting the corset, that double-edged sword of fashion, simultaneously admired and sighed over. Truth be told, dressing up was a bit like preparing for a costume ball without the wild dancing. Although there was certainly enough twirling involved just in tying up the laces, having perfected their look, the afternoon might bring a social call or two. These were the social media of the day, albeit slower and with far more lace. Visits were made with calling cards, which were left as proof of one's genteel intent. Rules stipulated that visits should be short enough to avoid tedium, yet long enough to discuss the truly important issues of the day, such as whether Mrs. So-and-so had bought her tea from the proper purveyor. Once the social niceties were seen to, a woman might take to something more personal, like embroidery. Here was an art form that demanded patience and passion, akin to crafting the titans of the ancient myths. Each stitch was a testament to beauty and resilience, embroidered into doilies and antimacassars with the kind of dedication that Napoleon himself might have envied, if only he had a penchant for cross-stitch. As dusk graces the cobblestone streets like soft golden honey, the time came for dinner. While a gentleman might dominate the conversation with trivial pursuits like economics or politics, a lady wielded her conversational acumen, discussing art or society. The true craft lay in never venturing too close to controversy, a skill that, much like a well-made meringue, took years to perfect. And as we drift through this luminous canvas of a day, the homely glow of candle-lit nights draws us toward whispers of sleep. In these soft folds of evening, the hushed paraphernalia of a grand Victorian household begins to settle. Gently, dear listener, let us transition into repose, with the rhythmic echoes of a world long past still softly twinkling in the distance like fireflies at eventide. And now, as we lie inserted in the gentle embrace of history itself, we can let the rippling currents of time carry us forward once more, deeper into this whimsical tapestry. Imagine, if you will, the soft rustle of heavy skirts gliding across grand yet slightly cold wooden floors. These rooms were adorned with the finest knickknacks that even a fervent modern minimalist would secretly long for. Victorian women, rich in both chiffons and tea cozies, traversed their days in a rhythm as intricate as the lace they crocheted, or had crocheted, if we are being honest. As the sun gingerly stretched its fingers through the heavy velvet curtains, Our Lady of the Manor was likely breaking her fast, often a light affair with toast that seemed balanced precariously on the fine line between warm bread and brittle cracker. Add a tepid cup of tea with a dash of cream from a beloved cow, whose name was likely Beatrice, and you have a typical Victorian breakfast. But alas, it was not merely marmalade and musings. Indeed, there were letters to read. Despite our technological advances, we must give Victorian women due credit for maintaining social networks long before the advent of Facebook, albeit at a considerably slower pace. Yet stalking was alive and well. Perhaps not of the digital variety, but rather that of thorough inquiries into births, betrothals, and the unfortunate incident involving Lady Weatherby's garden and an overly enthusiastic fox. Post-correspondence, one might assume the day would open into a sprawling canvas of lavish luxury, to paint upon it whatever leisure activity one desired. In truth, however, conspicuous idleness required a Herculean effort masked as effortlessness. There were visits to pay, a parade of social calls requiring veritable Olympic feats of gossip, deftly murmured behind fans, a ritual almost sanctified in its subtlety. You see, a true Victorian lady understood the profound wisdom of a well-placed "Did you hear?" And then there was the matter of domestic management. Under the discerning eye of the patriarchal society, the lady of the house was responsible for the empire of dust-free banisters and perfectly fluffed pillows. The skill lay in delegation, masterfully disguised as hands-on management. This involved patrolling the ranks of a household staff with a mixture of steely grace and the mildest of head nods, with a precise that could strike equal parts fear and respect, if not an Academy Award nod for Best Actress in a domestic role at the very least. Fashion, too, was not a hobby, but a pursuit demanding both time and graceful fortitude. Imagine layers upon layers of fabric cocooning one within, a sartorial embrace both reassuring and restrictive, reshaping the female form as much as the marshmallow layers reshape a s'more. One part elegance, one part a physical manifestation of ladylike patience. Afternoons were often occasions of wondrous balance lessons, thanks to towering hat styles and the skillful taming of voluminous petticoats. One had to evolve methods of surveillance not dissimilar to a royal guard, filtering the wind patterns and sudden movements to keep one's hat, a beacon of one's status, aloft yet secure. This, my dear listener, was a skill no less great than the balancing act of modern-day schedule juggling. Now, as the light dwindled and the chirping of evening crickets signaled nature's applause for yet another successful Victorian day, there were parlour games to be played. A game of whist or charades was less about the enjoyment and more an unspoken competition of wit, grace, and who could arch an eyebrow most archly whilst persuading the dealer to part with the trump card. And so, as the night settled, wrapped in its own velvety darkness, our Victorian heroine would retreat to her chamber. Bathed in the soft luminescence of candlelight, she would perch herself by the window, allowing the vista of stars to twinkle gently in her reflection. With a composition both of rest and anticipation, the page turned toward another day of intricate leisure. Yet for now, this gentle pause may just wander into the following chapter, as gracefully as Our Lady might step over the threshold into yet another day of elegant engagement. The sun gently draped the streets of Victorian England in a sepia glow, while the misty haze reminded everyone that cleanliness was a concept for the future. Our focus, however, was on those richly adorned parlours, where velvet and lace were in constant friction, much like the unsaid opinions of their owners. And so unfolds the day of a Victorian grande dame, beginning with the morning ritual of battling corsetry, a practice as constricting as it was gratifying. Having successfully won her skirmish with multiple layers of whalebone and fabric, our Victorian heroine would emerge from her boudoir ready for the day's first drama. Breakfast. Breakfast. A civilized affair, naturally, requiring a formal descent into a dining room that seemed to have more silverware than inhabitants. Breakfast tables were often adorned with platters, more inspired than appetites demanded, as gourmet chefs experimented with everything from eggs à la indifference to toast points that dared guests to find their purpose. Once sufficiently fed and feeling charitable, it was time for charity itself. Upper-class women often engaged in what was regarded as philanthropic activity, organizing charity events, attending to the needs of the poor, and graciously contributing to the art of getting nothing done with plenty of flourish. Fundraisers, for example, involved intricate planning and an incessant rotation of tea parties where sincerity was served in smaller doses than the scones. This doing of good was paradoxically considered quite fashionable. One could effectively measure a lady's social success by the length of her charitable endeavors, especially those involving ribbon-cutting ceremonies that ended with tasteful applause and occasional fainting spells due to over-exuberant corsetry. By mid-morning, the agenda would blissfully steer towards the noble art of correspondence. While today's digital communication strips us of punctuation and patience, Victorian women dug joyfully into their inkwells and uncorked their eloquence. Embarking on epistolary journeys, letters were written with such conviction, you'd think stone. Tablets were involved. Topics varied from matters of high society to lowly gossip, the latter being particularly compelling, like the social glue that kept the upper echelon loosely adhered. After correspondence, attention was often given to leisure activities cultivated under the guise of developmental skills. Enter the pianoforte, an instrument that served both as a symbol of sophistication and a tool of tactical warfare. The loudest rendition of Mozart usually secured a woman's marriage prospects, an auditory assurance to any romantic contenders that melody equaled matrimonial potential. Post-noon saw the liberating hours of promenades and shopping excursions. London's bustling streets brimmed with carriages, pedestrians, and enough horse manure to induce a gag reflex. Nevertheless, the street's allure was as invigorating as it was odorous. In restrained glee, our Victorian ladies shuffled past window displays, reveling in the latest fashion. Bonnet shopping was practically an Olympic sport, where elaborate headwear competed for complexity, size, and occasionally one's field of vision. Back home, the shadows began to lengthen, hinting ever so gently at afternoon tea. A pause both obligatory and anticipated. Tea time was the social cauldron where fortunes were discussed and rivals silently measured, all while clinking china suggested civilization. This daily ballet of teapot choreography involved precision and etiquette, where gossip trails ebbed and flowed as smoothly as the Darjeeling itself. As dusk painted the skies in hues of nostalgia, there were more formal invitations to be attended to. Dinners, balls, and the unpredictable musical soirees occupied this twilight stretch, requiring yet another dazzling wardrobe transformation. Silk gowns and sweeping dance floors beckoned, though most crucial was the fan, a tool of both flirtation and life-saving ventilation, when swoons threatened during especially dramatic waltzes. And so, the ami-day would draw to its inevitable, embellished close, like a carefully plotted serialized novel that never quite wanted to end. As sleep called softly in rhythms of twilight, one could almost hear silent gratitude for the invention of the nightgown, a garment as liberating as the corset was confining. And thus, with one last curtsy to propriety, our eve-tired lady would rest, dreaming perhaps of the gentle morrow, waiting beyond the night's embrace. Ah, the Victorian parlour, a haven of elegance, a sanctum of social codes, and quite possibly the sanctum sanctorum of convoluted social rituals that only the Victorian age could concoct. Picture, if you will, rich Victorian women gliding towards an upholstered armchair, their voluminous skirts not simply flowing but orchestrating a gentle swish that inspires avant-garde fashion designers 3 centuries hence. Once settled amongst the embroidered silk cushions, crafted using an impressively sophisticated maneuver they surely see practiced, they enter a world where the art of conversation becomes the day's greatest sport. But hush now, dear listener. Let not these quiet parlours fool you into despondency. Beneath layers of lace and tightly laced corsets, there lies a dynamic realm of ingenious gossip, strategic matchmaking, and oh yes, an endless parade of genteel pastimes. An afternoon resume might include engaging in a genteel game of whist, considered by many a thinly veiled battleground, where one could assume the guise of politeness while tactically assassinating an opponent's ace with all the civility of a lady tossing out yesterday's tea leaves. Indeed, it was within these walls that the subtle art of influence was honed to perfection. Each morning, well-to-do Victorian women embarked on the oral relay of what was affectionately known as calling, a veritable social tightrope walk. This involved visiting friends or acquaintances to trade countless polite nothings, all the while dropping hints like breadcrumbs about how splendidly one's own family affairs were motoring along without a single hiccup, or, much whispering later, how their neighbor's garden party hired the wrong musician. The ultimate goal, of course, was to glean stories delightful enough to pad out one's social repertoire. An afternoon well spent could produce enough gatherable gossip to fuel an entire season of Jane Austen-esque social entwining. Handwritten calling cards changed hands with the deftness of the most practiced illusionist's sleight of hand. Each finely pressed card was slipped ever so quietly into the household's calling card tray, a piece of furniture that stood as a barometer for one's social capital. Imagine a genteel Facebook, except privacy settings were determined by lace doilies and embroidered knickknacks. Though one could hardly forget the dominance of newly acquired pastimes, novels written by scandalous French authors imported surreptitiously, or cradled within the harmless covers of more acceptable literature. Here was an indulgence that promised a frisson of rebellion, a temporary escape from the vigilance of propriety enforced by the manners police. If questioned, a well-practiced Victorian lady could always claim it was all in the name of education, ensuring she remained cultured enough to confirm the distinction between a brioche and a simple bun. But while the parlor was a space for recreation and conniving charm, it was also the heart of incredible innovation. Craftwork abounded, from intricate lace-making to the art of floral arrangements. Chronicles of advanced knitting techniques, previously only seen in the grand tapestries of medieval period dramas, threatened to astonish the postman should he chance a glimpse through the lace curtains. For the fortunate few embroiled in the noble pursuit of music, pianos loomed large in home orchestras, representing financial commitment as well as cultural sophistication. Beethoven's Für Elise rang out not only as a herald for dinner is served, but also, presumably, to signal the cat is stuck in the wardrobe. And there we must leave the grand Victorian parlor, content with our newfound understanding of these women's everyday narratives, a blend of wit, wile, and the rigorous application of all things chic. Drift away on these charmingly clandestine echoes of velvet subterfuge and subtlety. With the gardens and their eternal tangle of domestic disputes a short jaunt away, we'll pause here, nestled like cherished knickknacks in the keepsake drawer of history, silently waiting for the next key to unlock another chapter of bygone days. Amidst the gently flickering candlelight and plush velvet drapes of the Victorian parlor, our lovely heroine, Edith Willoughby, settled into her afternoon ritual. With a soft sigh, she sank into one of those impossibly ornate chairs that were simultaneously marvels of craftsmanship and testaments to the endurance of the human spine. Ah yes, welcome to the age of Victorian elegance, where rich women in high-collared dresses and pearls glimmering like moonlit dew spent their days ensnared in the artful dance of leisure. This particular afternoon promised an activity that was perhaps the pinnacle of genteel triviality, the soul-stretching, dexterity-demanding world of embroidery. You see, in the Victorian era, embroidery was no mere pastime. Nay, it was an essential pillar of a lady's life, akin to a modern foam-thumb workout, but with marginally less risk of developing carpal tunnel. Edith, like many of her contemporaries, prided herself on producing landscapes of thread so intricate they could bring Monet to tears. Or in his case, perhaps squints. As she threaded her needle with the precision of a seasoned surgeon, her thoughts were blissfully untethered, drifting like a monarch butterfly on a summer breeze. Stitch by meticulous stitch, she recreated the pastoral scenes of their family estate in Somerset, a place where even the sheep seemed to dine on only the finest clover. The rhythm of needle-piercing fabric was a melody Edith had mastered, music to which the gentle snores of her pug, Mr. Snufflesworth, added a bass line that could only be described as avant-garde. As the cuckoo clock chimed softly in the corner, a charmingly over-engineered device that never quite understood the concept of daylight savings, Edith paused to rest her fingers and muse on the day's accomplishments. Ah, to be a woman of leisure. Here, in the heart of exuberant domesticity, each ornate inkwell and tasseled drapery told tales of a world beyond the parlor's walls. And yet, even for the most dutiful of embroiderers, monotony could sometimes creep like an ill-judged stitch. It was then that Edith's mind would wander to the more theatrical callings of the social calendar. This very evening, for example, promised the climax of the week, a soirée grander than that time Aunt Maud tried to feed her entire bridge club on a single Victoria sponge. Tonight's entertainment was enough to make one's corset strings tremble with anticipation. Charades. The good patriarch of the Ambrose family would insist on performing Dickens's entire bibliography. One can only imagine how well his Oliver Twist, "Please, sir, I want some more," played out, rather like a farce of cosmic proportions, eliciting titters behind fluttering fans and wide-eyed gasps of exaggerated admiration. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For the moment it was simply Edith, the needle, and her cozy companion, Mr. Snufflesworth. As the embroidery blossomed, so did the tranquility of the afternoon. The stories woven into her fabric brought with them a sort of dreamy contentment, the sort that makes the warm clasp of sleep almost inevitable. Yet, like the changing light of dusk, stillness turned her thoughts to a companion who shaped her world as much as the needle in her hand. Her sister, Clara, spirited and perpetually ahead of the hour, was likely, at this very moment, engaged in writing her groundbreaking essay on whether scones taste better when one is draped in silk or lace. Outside, a gentle rain began to patter against the window panes, a cozy percussion that seemed to harmonize with the soothing clinks of teacups being prepared downstairs. Edith knew soon she would join her family for this most sacred of English traditions, debating the existential worth of cucumber sandwiches while savoring the melodies of a single loose-leaf Darjeeling. And there, just as the embroidery hoop settled beside her cushion, another day in this politely tumultuous Victorian life ticked by. Sleep's tender approach whispered promises in the shadows of evening. With a soft sigh, Edith's thoughts drifted to the warmth of family and love, themes of a life embroidered far beyond mere stitchery. As the sun peeked behind the lace curtains of a grand Victorian parlour, a lady of leisure awoke, with a delicate sigh, ready to partake in her unusual yet thoroughly engaging morning routine. Yes, while one may imagine her life filled primarily with embroidering pillowcases and staring out at the garden, in reality, rich Victorian women had much more peculiar pursuits, like curling in bed for a solid hour, contemplating the sheer existential dread brought upon by a society obsessed with modesty. Having vanquished any trace of existential woe, Our Lady would slip from her cozy perch to her dressing table. There, she'd engage in the cerebral sport known to us today as fancy grooming, during which she would dedicate ample time applying various questionable concoctions of the era. The potions involved everything from arsenic-laced face powder to belladonna eye drops. After all, who wouldn't want to risk accidental poisoning to achieve a vibrant and terminally mysterious stare? But let us not dawdle on such high-stakes beauty regimes for too long, lest we fall under the spell of the Victorian motto, "Beauty is pain, and sometimes fainting." Having primped and primed for the day, it was time for breakfast, an affair less about sustenance and more about a slow, genteel affair among soft carpets and the chimes of a grandfather clock. Seated at the breakfast table, the lady would lightly delve into a thrilling missive of fictional woes and courtly scandal, the almighty novel by three esteemed sisters. Oh, the Brontes. Although frowned upon for women to be caught languishing in novels, Our stealthy Victorian hero knew the secret to a robust emotional journey lay hidden between the hardbound covers of Wuthering Heights. As the toast was gently buttered and tea poured with the precision of a seasoned chemist, our heroine unraveled the adventures of Heathcliff and Cathy with delightful abandon. Post-novel retreat, the lady would often find herself in a mood that demanded social interaction beyond the company of fictional characters. And what better way to achieve such merriment than to wreak havoc upon a piano with all the elegance of a gazelle learning to fence? Music was, after all, the social media of the 19th century. There, she could elicit sympathy or mild appreciation from similarly restless aristocratic captives yearning to be entertained in a parlor clouded with the scent of orris root and disappointment. But do not be deceived into thinking this was merely idle play. No, indeed, for in these melodic endeavors lay the sly strategy of 19th century courtship. Yes, her fingers would dance upon the ivory keys, signaling compatibility based upon one's tolerance to the sustained notes of a wayward sonata. For truly, nothing said. I'm available and vaguely interesting, more eloquently than a consistently on-key rendition of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Still, as the long shadows stretched across the sitting room, a curious interest often piqued her fancy, the burgeoning world of natural sciences. Being at an era when wealth and propriety allowed the luxury of curiosity, she might have ventured bravely into the garden, magnifying glass in hand, of course, dutifully inspecting the lesser-known and incredibly misunderstood insect population. Entomology was her brief escape from being prohibited to too many worldly professions. Darn those idiosyncratic rules of men. Her escapades into nature not only painted her cheeks with a delicate blush, but also fortified her stance at dinner parties, where she could speak with authority on the kingdom Animalia, or merely slip in an insect fact for an unintended yet delightful effect. Such were the secret triumphs of our Victorian heroine. As the day began to ebb away quietly, the ambient sound of clicking crickets signaled the descent into restful calm, much like the gentle hush that drifts over a well-read listener in the dark hours. Drifting to a close, as if chatting with a dear friend over tea, she would gather her thoughts, basking in the glow of a day well adorned with peculiarities and unexpected joys, readying her spirit for another peculiar day of Victorian endeavours. And so, as the candle flickered out in a friendly adieu, let us slip silently into the soft quietude of the moonlit night, where one's dreams may tangle with the whimsical, bygone days of Victorian ladyhood, ready to whisper a few more undiscovered secrets come the next magical dawn, amidst the hushed rustle of starched petticoats and the gentle clink of teacups. Let us pause for a moment and take a closer look at the entrancing pastimes of the Victorian elite. Picture, if you will, a day in the life of our Victorian heroine, Lady Priscilla Thimblewhistle, a woman with a penchant for adventure, mostly confined within the rose-scented confines of her drawing room. As dawn broke, diffused gently through lace curtains, Priscilla, ever the embodiment of fashion and propriety, would find herself engulfed in the daily logistical ballet of dressing, endeavor requiring the orchestral coordination of multiple maids and more patience than a tranquil tortoise. Dressing involved layers upon layers of snugly tied corsets and elaborately frilled gowns. It was less a matter of personal style and more a demonstration of one's endurance and agility, a morning regime befitting a dedicated athlete, albeit one who preferred champagne over chariots. Arduously attired, Priscilla would embark upon her favorite endeavor, the reading of calling cards. A card, a strategic tool of social networking, written on fine paper, crusted with enough gold leaf to make Midas weep, could determine her entire social calendar. Was she to spend the afternoon in refined frivolity at Lady Thistlebottom's parlour, or should she prepare for an evening engaging in an artfully stilted conversation with Lord Whifflebottom, not to be confused with the Thistlebottoms, as Victorians adored ambiguous surnames, often at the expense of clarity? Of course, Priscilla's afternoons were consumed by the subtle art of embroidery, a pastime akin to creating masterpieces with coloured floss, only with the added thrill of pricking one's fingers at conspicuously inconvenient moments. This genteel pursuit allowed for whispered exchanges of the day's gossip, an enlightening reflection, if you will, of how the great and good engaged in their own form of competitive storytelling long before Twitter made brevity all too fleeting. The tea hour, that quintessential British affair, would envelop Priscilla in a cloud of fragrantly steeped leaves and an assortment of delightfully heart-stopping pastries. Here, pastries were more than mere confections. They were culinary opus, simultaneously an offering and an emotional battleground. For a well-crafted scone could announce social stature just as firmly as any ancestral lineage. It was essential, therefore, to only enchant one's palate and not one's corset strings, which were known to snap, in protest if overstimulated by baked indulgences. Come the evening, and if Priscilla were lucky enough, she might entertain the vexingly fascinating world of seances. These gatherings promise murmurings from the beyond, guaranteeing the presence of both dearly departed spirits and the occasional stage-frightened medium whose dramatic swoons were best performed upon intricately upholstered fainting couches. Audience participation, while encouraged, was largely a matter of timed gasps and discreet eyebrow lifts. And thus, under the watchful eyes of the antique grandfather clock, ticking with the resolve of a vintage metronome, Priscilla would retire to her chamber, her day a tapestry of quiet amusements and whispered ambitions. Each day unfolded like a grand opera written in delicate measures, a melody shared with her companions of cards, corsets, and conversation. The velvet night would descend gently, as Priscilla burrowed beneath quilts stitched in tales of their own. Another day ahead, laden with the charming predictability of Victorian intricacies. As she drifted towards dreams, the moon smiled upon her closed eyes, hinting of yet more adventures huddled in the little particulars of life. But hush now, dear listener, and see how by day's end, the intricate dance of the Victorian woman pauses in sweet slumber. Her dreams of triumphs are gentle and light, just visible beneath the fluttering veil of twilight. Indeed, the shenanigans of tomorrow stir softly in the distance, ever awaiting their jesting hour. As the clock struck 3 and the afternoon sun dipped ever so subtly behind the lace curtains, casting delicate, dappled shadows across the walls, Lady Gertrude Fitcher found herself in the peculiar world of her own imagination, a place where the possibilities of embroidery and scandal waltzed hand in hand. Here, amid the comfort of plump cushions and the aroma of freshly brewed Darjeeling, we enter the Victorian lady's sacred hour of afternoon, tea. While the beverage itself may have been the centerpiece, ensuring that one's porcelain cup matched unobtrusively with the saucer, the entire ritual was an elaborate affair. Picture, dear listener, a small consortium of exquisitely clad women seated around an ornate table, which groaned slightly under the weight of cakes, pies, and sandwiches, all sliced to dimensions that required the delicate pinch of thumb and forefinger, a practice that doubled as dexterity training for eventual confrontations with misbehaving corsets. The scene was enough to lull the mind into a decadent dreamscape, where idle gossip floated like slender wisps of gentle steam above their teacups. Here, rumors were traded with the discretion of a well-placed flirt, and tales of the day's minor catastrophes spun like tales from a penny, dreadful, narrated by a gentle breeze with a hint of mischief. Yet, for Gertrude and her esteemed companions, this was not merely a time to sip and chatter whimsically. Nay, it was also an opportunity for the clandestine exchange of the latest fashion plates, smuggled through genteel whispers as if they were treasures from lost Egyptian tombs. How daring, one might gasp, to think Emerald could perform so profoundly this season. Indeed, arranging a visit to one's dressmaker now required strategic finesse akin to planning a royal coup. But beware, not every morsel sticking to their tongues was sweet. It was here, amidst the society of sugar cubes and silver spoons, that the mysteries of great dramas unfolded. The secret scandals involving neighbors' garden parties gone rogue, the unexpected widow deemed overly buoyant for her freshly mourned state, and last but certainly not least, the ceaseless debate on whether a proper lady might brave the revolutionary bloomer dress for her afternoon constitutional. And so, as the sunlight played a gentle lullaby through satin drapes, blending the day's realities with a dreamlike indulgence. 1. Couldn't help but marvel at the rich tapestry of life seen through rose-tinted parlors of tea, a place as much of silent rebellion as repose. Amidst delicate sips of fortifying brew, Gertrude's imagination soared to the dizzying heights of her favorite sensation novels, those brilliantly absurd tales that promised ladies a Parker penknife thrill far removed from their quotidian realities. In these paper-bound worlds, one never encountered a missing dinner fork or a wilted bouquet. Instead, there were dastardly villains, heady romance, and, even more thrilling, a heroine capable of an independent thought or two. Our drowsy encounter with Gertrude doesn't conclude in hyperbole, for tea hours also often included the indoctrination of the genteel arts. The piano remained an ever-present beast to be tamed, its keys lying poised like lions in wait to roar ever so softly at an impertinent finger strike. Time meandered in that familiar sleepy haze, much like the rivulets of cream, cascading into ebony-hued cups, promising velvet dreams. And just as idle chatter drifted into contemplative pauses, it would be time to think of more serious things, perhaps an impromptu meeting with one's personal stationery, or that perilously unattended correspondence pile, threatening to become a butte of domestic unrest. As the last of the biscuits crumbled to dusty memory, and the ticking of the parlour's perennially reliable clock nudged the afternoon into evening's embrace, one might find amusement in reflecting on such tepidly adventurous exploits. This day-to-day speculation held within its confines the exquisite essence of both sleep and surprise, as if whispering, "Prepare," yet never revealing for what. With the echoes of quaint laughter and the gentle clinking of porcelain still soft in the mind, Lady Gertrude now prepared herself for yet another intriguing aspect awaiting in the hush of evening. But for now, let us allow your mind to remain gently cradled in these afternoon reveries as we approach new, secretive shadows where yet more curious discoveries roam. As the soft glow of morning tiptoed through the ornate lace curtains of an affluent Victorian lady's boudoir, her day began not with a bang, but with a delicate shuffle. Picture, if you will, Lady Cecilia lying amongst a sea of plush, overstuffed pillows, each more elaborate than a Rococo painting. The air, thick with the fluttering promise of another day, was predictably fragrant, thanks to the previous night's liberal application of lavender water. The morning symphony began with the faint rustle of her lady's maid, who, like a magician's apprentice, inexplicably managed to appear from the shadows bearing a steaming cup of Earl Grey. For a brief, blissful moment, Lady Cecilia contemplated the meaning of life, but mostly, she pondered whether she'd have her toast buttered on one side or both. Decisions, decisions. Gently pried from the warm cocoon of downy indulgence, she was escorted to the dressing room, a space that was less a room and more a wardrobe homage to the entire animal kingdom. Minks and ermines, ostrich feathers and silks, an assembly of textures assembled to convey, "Oh, this old thing?" with just the slightest hint of appropriate disdain. Now, dressing for society was no mere 5-minute affair. It was equivalent to assembling a masterpiece, one where layers upon layers of fabric acted as brushstrokes. Corsets, cinched tighter than society's rules, made breathing somewhat of a gentle suggestion rather than a requirement. The bustle, a structural marvel in its own right, provided enough room upon which to balance not only books, but possibly small pets. With her armor securely donned, Lady Cecilia waltzed into mid-morning, ready to conquer the day's social adventure. Calling. Calling, dear listener, involved visiting acquaintances and engaging in conversations about absolutely nothing, with unparalleled charm. Once calling, cards were crucial. Beautifully engraved, they were the social media handles of the Victorian age, with fewer cat videos, but just as much drama. The afternoon was a delicate daisy chain of trivial engagements, whose daughter was rumoured to have fainted at the gala, which gentleman had taken to collecting far too many waistcoats, and most importantly, who had landed on the wrong side of the fashion spectrum's fickle favour. Life among the well-heeled was governed not just by dress codes and dance cards, but also by the intoxicating sweetness of afternoon tea. Gathered among bouquets of hydrangeas and spinning tales as sweet as the tarts they nibbled, the ladies of leisure embarked on a ritual as sacred as any, discussing the latest serialized novel installment. Gasping at cliffhangers, they compared heroes over sips of freshly steeped scandals. Dickens was devoured faster than the cucumber sandwiches, page by page, tier by tier, as twilight draped its silken veil over early evening, and gas lamps flickered to life with a soft, obliging sigh. Lady Cecilia returned to her abode. A dainty etching of domestic bliss, the dinner table was set to host an intimate affair, a small but highly scrutinized supper party. Such gatherings were more about the performance than the pot roast. Here glances spoke novels, and witticisms were exchanged as delicately as sugar tongs pass sweets. Once the last guest's farewell dissolved into a night whisper, Lady Cecilia retired to the library, or more accurately, the library chaise longue, whilst her favourite book stretched languidly across her lap. Here, she allowed the pages to transform her drawing-room's stiff world into realms where creatures of whimsy played and prose pirouetted. It was a gentle time of day when reality drifted away on the scented breeze of imagination, and dreams began to weave their tapestry of wonders. As the embers of the fireplace waned to a hum of sleepy warmth, Lady Cecilia prepared to meet the embrace of her four-poster bed, its curtains drawn like the closing act of a day well lived. Her eyelids fluttered gracefully, as if the finger of Morpheus himself were gently lowering them. Yet, just before sweet slumber claimed her thoughts, a slow, creeping reminder of tomorrow's charity event nudged its way into her consciousness. But that is a gentle adventure for another time. As twilight draped its velvety shawl over the cobblestone streets of Victorian England, a hush descended upon the opulent manor houses where society's refined dames took refuge from the bustling clatter of carriages and the ceaseless cries of street vendors. Within these grand domiciles, where the scent of lilacs flirted with the lingering warmth of afternoon tea, a peculiar ritual unfolded, a dance as graceful as it was pragmatic, the daily assembly of the wardrobe. Imagine a room more expansive than some modern micro-apartments, dedicated solely to the billowing chaos that was a Victorian woman's attire. A battalion of skirts fluttered like gentle waves, corsets stood at attention, and lace collars awaited their moment of glory. It was here that our illustrious Victorian heroine, let's call her Lady Mildred, devoted a considerable portion of her day to the sartorial symphony that whispered not merely of fashion, but of rank, poise, and the delicious allure of societal superiority. Today, Lady Mildred faced the delicate conundrum of choosing the perfect ensemble for a rather thrilling afternoon, the charity dirigible race. It was an event of such daring and spectacle that it was whispered even Queen Victoria might forsake her knitting to attend. But alas, our dear Mildred was not one to be flustered by the prospect of narrow escapes from gravity's relentless grip, or the insidious advances of rival socialites brandishing an errant elbowed parasol in a heated contest. Enter stage right, her loyal lady's maid, Beatrice, a woman of unmatched understanding in the Byzantine art of Victorian fashion. She was, after all, the undisputed St. Peter of the wardrobe gates. Beatrice wielded this authority with the skill of a conductor, nudging Lady Mildred towards a pastel chartreuse silk, claiming it would contrast superbly with the overcast sky, and perhaps afford a hint of success in the charitable wagers that inevitably accompanied ballooning affairs. As layers upon layers were donned, one could almost hear the gentle sigh of silk and the whisper of lace, murmuring secrets of bygone elegance while naturally constricting any prospect of a deep breath. Corsets were snugged and tightened, as tight as the latest scandal, with bone stays protesting gently against the demands of both fashion and physics. Once encased within her orchestrated armor, Lady Mildred emerged victorious from the sartorial battlefield. She possessed the kind of poise that makes one ponder if a royal decree demanded Victorian women balance teacups on their heads during childhood, simply to ensure such unparalleled grace in later years. The dressing ordeal complete, Lady Mildred would proceed to the morning room with time enough to indulge in the pastime that single-handedly supported a small industry, writing letters. Victorians were, if nothing else, enthusiastically verbose. And thus, with inkpot freshly filled and quills trimmed to a fine point, she would inscribe meticulously florid missives, deftly intertwining news, gossip, and outrage over the Duchess of Wellingbrook's recent indiscretions during a parlour game. There is, after all, nothing quite so exhilarating as vicarious scandal viewed from a safe distance through the lens of inked pleasantries. As the time for the dirigible event approached, our heroine readied herself to brave the social skies, but not before a swift consultation with Beatrice regarding the strategic placement of a hatpin. After all, one wouldn't want to sabotage one's own fashionable sail with a wayward gust, lest it blow her millinery masterpiece clean off to the bemusement of onlookers. With a decorum befitting her station and a sparkle in her eye that whispered of adventure's allure, Lady Mildred proceeded from the grandiose portal of her home, her parasol a swaying semaphore to the parlour society that lay beyond. The dirigible race awaited, a spectacle through which she, and many others, would parade their social finesse beneath the capricious whims of the English sky. And so, with the echo of padded footfalls and the gentle closing of a door, Lady Mildred embarked into the nascent events of the afternoon, a flurry of silk and purpose, unknowingly setting the stage for yet another spirited engagement beneath the expansive canopy of Victorian gaiety. As the sun peeked coquettishly through the thick lace curtains of a rather opulent Victorian boudoir, it would find our protagonist, Lady Millicent Appleville, already embarking on her daily ritual. One would think that wealth and leisure would equate to all-day lounging in embroidered slippers, nary a care in the world. But this is the Victorian era, and with privilege came a peculiarly intricate web of daily duties that only the rich could weave. Lady Millicent's morning began with a grandiloquent breakfast in bed. You see, unlike the common folk who settled for a slice of toast at best, Millicent was presented each morning with an assortment of pastries, jams, and sugared peculiarities, a dish resembling scrambled eggs, but with the involvement of white truffles. Why did she eat in bed, you might wonder? Well, it was quite the ostentatious display, signalling to everyone in her household that she, unlike others, had the libertine luxury of a half-hearted start to her day. Once the sustenance was complete, her day transitioned subtly into the realm of correspondence hour. This involved a meticulously precise ritual wherein Lady Millicent would compose letters, copious amounts of them. Donations for benevolent societies, invitations to opulent balls, and discreet notes hidden within silk-lined envelopes to gentlemen whose company was delightfully suitable for her afternoon tea engagements. But here's where the wit of our wistful Millicent shone. Having a sly sense of humour, her letters were often peppered with witticisms meant to puzzle or provoke a whimsical chuckle. In the Victorian age, the seemingly innocent bout of writing was often the battlefield for societal one-upmanship. A misplaced semicolon or an overly smudged wax seal could lead to gossip more scandalous than the price of tea imports following a particularly dry season in Ceylon. Maintaining social standing through postal pleasantries was no small feat and much akin to a beautifully written farce. With the dispatching of letters came the all-important dress hour. Victorian fashion was a labyrinthine dance of silks, bustles, petticoats, and the occasional whalebone corset that seemed to have come straight out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. Each article of evening wear spoke a language of its own, and misjudging the tone could result in a most dreadful faux pas. Complementing one's attire with the perfect hat was akin to selecting a loyal companion, ensuring it was both chic and didn't remove the tone of voice entirely should conservations move outdoors. And once suitably armoured in her sumptuous silk and ruffled regalia, it was time for the afternoon promenade. A stroll through Hyde Park was, after all, the Victorian equivalent of scrolling through an endless feed. Who was wearing what? Who was seen parading with whom? These jaunts served as the vine out of which the grapevine of gossip grew. But to Lady Millicent, it was a chance to exercise her truly enviable skill, people watching with a critical eye and a wry grin. By the time dinner rolled around back at the Appleville estate, the day's social encounters provided enough fodder for equally sumptuous tales shared over candied fruits and roast. A pheasant. But amidst it all, Lady Millicent cherished the moments of reflective solitude in her private library, where each book was a friend and each creased spine a story waiting to sweep her away. Speaking of reading, or more accurately, being read to, a privilege often reserved for the truly opulent, books were explored in comfortable armchairs as a means of swapping the personas of the day with those of fictional worlds filled with adventure. Here, truths mixed seamlessly with daydreams, a fitting end to any Victorian day. As we let Lady Millicent's busy day unwind into the soft glow of candlelit corridors and quiet murmurings of the setting sun, perhaps we too feel the pull of time woven through sepia pages where whispers of yesterday lull us gently towards slumber, promising the reveal of another chapter waiting in the wings of tomorrow's dawn. In the whimsical garden of Victorian high society, where bonnets bloomed like tulips and corsets cinched tighter than a gentleman's handshake, one might think that days drifted by in a parade of dull decorum. But of course, life is never quite what it seems at a tea party. Behind the lace curtains and under the ironed crinolines of every proper parlour, intriguing vignettes of rich Victorian women's daily lives unfolded with a peculiarly delightful flair. Picture yourself beside Lady Hightower, who woke each morning not to the reliable crow of a rooster, but rather to the pretty peals of a porcelain alarm clock, an indulgence of her husband's latest voyage to the Orient, where such devices were whispered to include both dragons and destiny. Stretching languidly like a cat in the sun, she summoned her lady's maid through the tottering house of cards that was the household bell system, a network as unreliable as gossip over scones. After the morning ablutions, which involved an orchestra of scented soaps and a wardrobe resembling a theatre set change, Lady Hightower embarked on her morning letter-writing ritual. Here, seated at her intricately carved mahogany desk, she constructed meticulous epistles with the poise of a general commanding troops, equipped with ink so thick it could very well weigh down a canary. The subjects ranged widely, from admonishing her cousin Felicity for marrying beneath her station, a mere viscount, can you imagine, to the pressing matter of whether pea green was truly the colour of the season. Occasionally, her letters featured illustrations drawn in vivid detail, as if trying to convince herself, and her correspondents, that life was indeed more colourful than reality might suggest. Once the ink had dried and the letters dispatched with more seals than an Antarctic expedition, social visits became the order of the day. For someone like Lady Hightower, this did not merely involve idle chatter over weak tea, but was rather a display of diplomacy and espionage. She had developed an uncanny knack for collecting and cataloguing the myriad, small mysteries and scandals that flurried through the parlours of her peers. It was rumoured she had a mental archive so vast it rivaled the British Museum. All this intel was, of course, gathered while artfully teasing her lace handkerchief, which she wielded with the finesse of a magician. Afternoons daintily drifted by like swans in a pond during art lessons, where she attempted to capture in oils and watercolours the eternal struggles of a fruit bowl on canvas. In these moments of artistic endeavour, Lady Hightower exhibited a surprisingly mischievous side, often adding a cheeky extra grape or an indignant pear to her still life, the kind of artistic rebellion that middle-class maidens could only dream of. Then came the ultimate test of nerves and noses, the afternoon promenade. Here, Lady Hightower, armed with a hat that could double as a birdhouse, sashayed down Hyde Park, bobbing gracefully among the flock of fashionable fowl. Each swoosh of her skirt was carefully calculated to display her frock's finest embroidery without crossing into the scandalously suggestive territory of showing an ankle. The promenade was both a social event and an unspoken battle of one-upmanship, where the sharpest daggers were smiles and personal successes concealed beneath a well-placed feather. As the day melted into evening, Lady Hightower donned a gown worthy of its own ballad, preparing for the symphony of dinner. Amidst courses stacked higher than confidence in Queen Victoria's rule, The conversation danced around foreign politics, the latest scientific discoveries, and overtly dramatic observations such as the perfect poached pear dessert, the core of which bore an uncanny resemblance to the opera's new tenor. It was a finale of witty ripostes and well-rehearsed laughter, occasionally punctuated by genuine mirth at a particularly bold jibe. Finally, when the clock gently nudged towards the witching hour, Lady Hightower retired with a careful ritual of unwinding. Under the watchful gaze of moonlight filtered through damask curtains, she nestled into her cloud-like bed, a masterpiece of fluffy engineering, closing her eyes on the rich, textured entirety of another day spent weaving through the tapestry of Victorian life. And so, as the stars twinkled their Victorian lamps and whispered their celestial secrets, Lady Hightower drifted into dreams, where even the mundane masqueraded as magical within the veiled allure of history's velvet grip. As the amber glow of a gas lamp flickered softly in the corner, the clock on the mantel ticked with a gentle persistence, marking another quiet evening in the parlour of a Victorian home. Our legendary heroine of leisure, Lady Evangeline Pettigrew, an enthusiast of the finer, albeit delightfully curious aspects of existence, sat reclined in her plush, velvet chair. Her day was winding down with a favourite activity among her social set, the nightly ritual of writing letters full of nothing, terribly important but enriched with embellishments worthy of a poet laureate who's had one too many sips of port. For those steeped in the stereotypes of yore, you might suspect a woman of leisure in the mid-1800s did little more than balance her bonnet stylishly atop her head or dance the quadrille under gilded chandeliers. However, Lady Pettigrew, with a mind as sharp as the silver letter opener resting beside her, found much amusement in the art of correspondence concoction. Indeed, one must not overlook the monumental influence a wittily worded letter could wield. The social networks of the Victorian era lived and thrived through these missive exchanges, composed ever so eloquently in a sprawl of ink and good intentions. On this particular evening, Lady Evangeline embarked on an epistolary adventure addressed to her dear friend, Lady Gertrude Wickett Brown, informing her of the scandalous new shade of wallpaper selected for the drawing room. Described with the hyperbole one, always might reserve for the return of Halley's Comet, the pistachio enchantment was as daring in its hue as it was in its existential impact on matters of modern style. Colour choices were, unquestionably, the gossip of the day. Or at least they were when you had little else to occupy your hours between tea and supper. Her pen glided across the paper with the ferocity of a sparrow taking flight, each word as meticulously intentional as a corset string pulled just to the threshold of comfortable suffocation. The evening ritual of letter writing was rife with unspoken etiquette. There were social pitfalls as treacherous as the corset itself. The art of subtly intertwining compliments with inquiries while maneuvering through conversational topics like the most delicate of lace doilies on a Sunday ottoman. Of course, considering the subtle intrigues exchanged by Victorian ladies through their letters, it could reasonably be assumed one standing in polite society hung by the very thread on which one's post was delivered. Far from mere trifles, her letters held the power to fan social flames, ignite the passions of intrigue, or even deflate the allure of an otherwise nettlesome rival, a common fixture in every social circle, scuttling from drawing room to party, as though their sole purpose in life were to wear the most heinous of bonnets just to gossip about yours. Once her sentiments were sufficiently inked and sealed with a curiously ornate wax stamp, a dragonfly, chosen after a short-lived penchant for enthusiasm in entomology, Lady Evangeline set aside her correspondence with a contented sigh. There was a certain satisfaction to be found in the stylized diffusion of her missives, as if scattering seeds of delightful discourse across the fallow fields of Upper and Lower Pettigrew. Her irreverence for the mundane, and a knack for transforming it into brilliantly mundane propriety, had, by now, resulted in a small collection of sought-after letters known throughout her circle as works of rare literary fancy. With the end of the day's duties done, the gas lamp dimmed its glow, casting the room in the sort of serene shadows that dream weavers might envy. Lady Evangeline turned her thoughts towards the cozy comfort of her bedchamber, where adventures of the mind would rest and rejuvenate under layers of eiderdown dreams. Tomorrow, she thought, might bring another letter, another bottled note of human connection to drift along social currents and eventually come to rest in someone else's parlor, awaiting discovery. And so, as sleep claimed the night in a gentle embroidery of silence, the restlessness of the Victorian day softened into slumber, leaving only the whisper of paper as a sweet reminder of the day's grandiosity, a modest amusement held closely by those who let their minds wander with the courage of imagination uncaged until morning's first light would inspire the next chapter of life's delicate adventures. Imagine yourself floating gently above the cobblestone streets of Victorian London, where the soft glow of gas lamps paints a soothing picture of a world long past. This quaint backdrop provides the perfect setting to delve into Lady Penelope's world, our quintessential rich Victorian woman of leisure. Now Lady Penelope, with her lace-cuffed sleeves and penchant for the finer things, would typically greet the morning with a cup of tea, as any self-respecting Victorian lady would. This was not merely a cup of tea, it was a ritual infused with dialogues about the weather, because who doesn't like to discuss meteorological phenomena before breakfast? As the steam curled around her face, it was almost as if the rising vapors carried with them all the day's possibilities and potential gossip. Following this invigorating tea session, which managed to stimulate just enough, but not too much, heavens forbid one be too invigorated, Lady Penelope would move on to her correspondence. In this, had the pre-tweet era, letter writing was an art form, an exchange of pleasantries dripping with florid prose. The challenge was to outdo the last letter with ever more ostentatious flourishes while discussing the most mundane of topics. Penelope took pride in perfecting the exquisite balance between charmingly banal and excruciatingly polite. Once pen had been laid to rest, the ladies of the Victorian elite found themselves staring down the particularly strenuous activity of wardrobe selection. To say that their outfits were elaborate would be akin to calling the British Empire a little ambitious. The selection process was a delicate dance. Decisions had to be made: silk or satin, ostrich or peacock feathers. Which shoes would appropriately convey her mood? A wardrobe choice was not simply sartorial. It was often a covert communique to those in the know, coded entirely in taffeta and lace. Dressed to the nines and adequately corseted, because, internal organs only serve its minimal functions. It was time for some light entertainment. A popular pastime was the salon. No, not the type where hair is coiffed, but a gathering of the intellectual and the influential, peppered with that keen social sport known as witty repartee. It was here that rich Victorian women like Lady Penelope could casually discuss topics such as the merits of the Industrial Revolution or why moustaches are so passé, all while deftly wielding the fan, an indispensable tool for both signaling and self-defense in an unexpectedly aggressive debate on bonnet styles. Should Lady Penelope find her debates too invigorating and feel the need for repose, she might retire to her drawing room. Ah, the drawing room. A sanctuary for introspection and post-afternoon tea lounging. It was the perfect venue for partaking in activities like watercolor painting, though to Penelope, attempting to capture a likeness of her beloved poodle in cerulean blue proved similarly trying as capturing the Victorian zeitgeist itself. After her creative passions were sufficiently exercised, a promenade was in order, a rather grandiose term implying a leisurely stroll, ensuring one's presence was noted and appropriately admired among her peers. It was essentially the Instagram of its time, with every hushed whisper and doffed hat serving as a like. Eventually, as the Victorian sun dipped below the horizon, it was time for supper, a genteel affair over which great alliances, social of course, were forged. These meals were never merely about sustenance. Each dish, be it a roast or a custard, was a conversation opener, a prelude to the post-dinner discussions that could linger until the moon hung high. With her mind swathed in the pleasantries of the day, eyes heavy from good company and the labyrinthine laces of her stays, Lady Penelope would finally retire. Yet as the flickering lamplight cast shadows through the gauzy curtains, she couldn't help but wonder what adventures the morrow might bring. replete as it might be with new fashions, forays into public reforms from a safe distance, and yet another opportunity to perfect the delicate art of being whimsically busy. But that, dear listener, is a story for another evening of gentle exploration and cozy curiosity as we drift onward into the dreamscape of history's quieter corners. Welcome to another delightful evening of historical exploration through the opulent world of Victorian fashion. But tonight, we're slipping behind the silk curtains and into the elaborate reality of Victorian women dressing for the day, a saga that could rival any grand novel of the time. Imagine waking up on a dewy English morning in your luxurious Victorian bed, a delicate cocoon of lace and plush pillows as you yawn like a pampered kitten. Ah, the joys of being a wealthy lady in the era of Queen Victoria. But before you indulge in the affections of your fluffy Persian cat, there's the small matter of assembling a personal attire that could rival the most intricate architectural feats. Victorian fashion was particularly famous for its layers. Imagine dressing in more layers than an onion, which may or may not contribute to an air of tearful nostalgia each morning. As you rise from slumber, your lady's maid, Sarah, bless her dexterous fingers, is already on standby, carefully orchestrating today's sartorial symphony. First comes a sigh, and the chemise, a humble undergarment befitting a classical toga, a soft embrace of cotton or linen that serves as the foundation for the day's ensemble. You won't be wearing just one petticoat, oh no. This is Victorian society. More excess, more success. Up next is the corset, a contraption that could be described as an emergency hug or a misguided boa constrictor, cinching it just tight enough to bestow upon you that coveted hourglass figure, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones amongst the afternoon tea set. As Sarah laces you into this symbol of fashionable fortitude, consider those unfortunate souls of future Pilates classes who might debate the necessity of rib-shifting waistlines. Fortunately, you have no such existential dilemmas. Instead, there's the stay busk, a busk that, for some illogical reason, insists on defying gravity with the precision of a Victorian ironclad ship. Once properly corseted, it's time for layer 3, the petticoats. Ruffles, lace, and a whiff of starch emanate as they swathe around your legs. Each layer adds an echo of significance, a cascade of fabric befitting your standing. There's Highland tartan for a jaunt to the countryside, elegantly embroidered silk for an afternoon promenade, and embroidered muslin should you wish to grace London's Hyde Park with your graceful, gravity-defying presence. The crowning glory is, of course, the dress, made to measure and resplendent with patterns echoing that mysterious, oriental flair that's all the rage. It truly is fashion's signature anthem. Imagine gliding through parlors in deep sapphire or rich emerald, a goddess walking among mere mortals, or at least until you trip on an unruly train of fabric cascading behind you like a tale that never received the memo on boundaries. Finally, we tackle the delicate acts of accessorizing. Gloves that fit like a second skin, a bonnet artfully arranged atop your meticulously curled hair, and perhaps an elegant brooch that whispers of family heirlooms and stately manners. Each item a careful choice, painting a portrait of poise and prosperity, for appearances in this era are as important as a flawless sponge cake. Fully dressed and exquisitely bundled, you are now ready to venture forth. The world is your stage, or at least the ornate sitting room, where the body's caloric intake will soon vanish into the ether of afternoon teas. With the final flourish of today's dress completed, we prepare for the world outside, one full of gentlemen callers and afternoon gossipers, thick as clotted cream. Even more important, we note how the day's weather can influence fashion's creed, dictating your dress and social engagement radius. Can those petticoats brave the infamous London fog, or will rain force you to remain tucked safely inside with only the glowing warmth of a crackling fireplace? As you face the mirror, marvel at your reflection. A picture of polished elegance, and layers that could outwit a Victorian fruitcake. Now poised on the brink of today's adventure, we ease gently forward, leaving behind the rhythmic rustle of satin skirting and into a day as promising as any well-crafted literary sequel. And so, with our ensemble complete and sartorially transported through an era of elegance, let's drift effortlessly into the realm of what these finely dressed foremothers of society might have made of leisure. Or was it labor? With this gentle thought nurturing curiosity, we coalesce toward an ever-unfurling tapestry of finds sure to tantalize the minds of any avid historians amongst us. As the clock chimed 10 and the gas lamps shivered with intrigue, our journey lands gracefully into the drawing rooms of Victorian high society. Here, amid plush velvet drapes and intricately embroidered pillows, we find Lady Augusta, our witty and ever so slightly mischievous hostess for the evening. Lady Augusta, like many of her contemporaries, engages in a quintessential activity popular with the landed gentry of her time, the salon. No, my dear listener, not the type where you ponder if bangs make you look mysterious, but the intellectual kind, where minds were coiffed and pruned into works of art. Like a curious cat, she introduces various conversation topics, effortlessly slipping from the philosophies of John Stuart Mill to the latest bodice-ripping serialized novel scandalizing the neighbors. With a gleam in her eye, she doles out witty repartees like freshly baked scones, leaving her guests chuckling softly, careful not to spill their tea. This gathering is not merely an event, it's a performance of some social ballet practiced over years, though still subject to mishap. Picture, if you will, Sir Humphrey, accidentally kicking one of Augusta's delicate houseplants. The startled fern shivers, showering a gentle rain of soil and leaves onto his polished shoes. He laughs awkwardly, pulling at his waistcoat, while Lady Augusta raises one bemused eyebrow but graciously pardons the spectacle with a witty quip about the balance of nature and nurture. As the banter warms and the evening deepens, it's common for the ladies to retreat to the card table to engage in games with names as whimsical as the players, such as speculation, a favorite among those not particularly interested in making speculative investments outside of gossip shares. Amidst the shuffling of cards, the rustle of silk, and the warm glow of candlelight, these gatherings serve as the social marketplace where rumors trade hands faster than Queen Victoria's royal edicts. Sometimes, if the evening ambience is just right, someone like Lady Constance might rouse herself from her otherwise reserved disposition to read aloud from a book. The room grows quiet, ears leaning forward as she breathes life into Byron's stanzas and Keats's odes, their poetic fervour trickling into the hearts of even the sternest of lords. There, amidst a halo of words, one feels time slipping away, melting like sugar into tea. Meanwhile, there's always an unplanned intermission when the house pets make their grand appearances. Lady Augusta's Persian cat, Viscount Flufflesworth, shall nonchalantly stroll through the room, flicking his plumed tail as if moderating the discourse. His presence is both a distraction and an essential element of the nightly ceremonies. For in these drawing rooms, even the animals partake in the grandeurs of Victorian life, thrown upon their silk pillows, entertained by the curious throng of humanity with all its glorious quirks and graces. Of course, not all evenings end in the echo of laughter or whispered revelations. Occasionally, disputes might flare, like that memorable duel fought with words over the correct method of toasting crumpets. But our dear Lady Augusta, unfazed, douses potential fires with the deftness of a seasoned diplomat, sweeping any lingering tension under the friendly roar of the fireplace. As the grandfather clock winds itself toward the midnight hour, the gathering disperses like a dream upon waking, leaving behind only echoes of laughter and the scent of lavender sachets. Guests bid their farewells, stepping out into the crisp night, where gas lamps draw swirls of light in the misty air, each returning to their own manor homes with heads enriched and hearts softly glowing from the evening's camaraderie. A calm descends upon the dimly lit rooms once again as Lady Augusta stretches before the hearth, her cat now curled contently in her lap. There's a quiet, gentle satisfaction in knowing that such nights are woven into the fabric of life, a tapestry of connection, wit, and shared stories wrapped in the cocoon of history. As our night's tale draws to a close, a gentle reminder lingers in the air, suggesting that there is more yet to discover, beyond the forgotten shadows of Victorian corridors, where the whispers of the past wait patiently to be heard once again in the soft quietude of another evening's embrace. As twilight softly wrapped its embrace around the Victorian countryside, whispering a lullaby that encouraged even the wind to hush, we delved gently into an evening at an opulent yet peculiarly unusual household. Mrs. Penelope Butterworth, an esteemed Victorian lady whose elegance was closely rivaled only by her eccentric charm, was just beginning her evening ritual. While one might assume her evening activities would consist solely of needlepoint and reading sonnets by candlelight, Penelope's true passion was far more sparkling. You see, Mrs. Butterworth had developed an unwavering fascination with beetle wing embellishments. These shimmering decorations, made from the iridescent shells of jewel beetles, became all the rage in the higher echelons of Victorian society. No ball gown was fully en vogue without at least a light smattering of these glistening gems. Naturally, Penelope took this trend to extremes, embellishing not just gowns, but hats, parasols, and once, infamously, her husband's pocket watch, much to his chagrin. As the evening shadows grew long, Mrs. Butterworth commenced her clandestine hobby by lighting an array of candles arranged precisely on her work desk, a spectacular shrine to sparkle if there ever was one. She opened her precious box of beetles, revealing a mesmerizing kaleidoscope of colorful wings. To anyone else, it might have been an otherworldly blend of intrigue and mild discomfort, but to Penelope, it was a veritable treasure trove, despite the grand ostentations of bright silks and bustling fabrics. Her humbler, more peculiar pastimes were unbeknownst to many, an understated detail that added depth to the layered tapestry of her Victorian life. With delicate, nimble fingers, she began affixing those iridescent wonders, humming a tune that was part lullaby, part nonsensical ditty about beetles ruling a tea party. It was a composition only she could appreciate, until her loyal cat, Sir Fluffington, chimed in with a well-timed purr, as if to harmonize with her evening symphony. In between meticulous stitching and the soft shuffle of a feline companion, Mrs. Butterworth allowed her mind to wander to the musings of the day. She considered her recent encounter with Lady Ebenezer, who had astonishingly claimed beetle wings to possess otherworldly properties, able to attract fortune, and perhaps even ward off a pesky relative or two. While Penelope found this stance rather theatrical, she couldn't help but indulge in a suppressed giggle at the thought of magical beetle wings repelling the ever-tedious Aunt Muriel. The mesmerizing dance of emerald gold and azure wings caught the flickering candlelight, creating a kaleidoscope that bewitched the room into a tranquil lull. It seemed her entire life revolved around these delicate adornments. However, despite the glamour that this hobby suggested, truth be told, it was her spirited ingenuity and penchant for creativity, rather than sheer fashion pretense, that fueled her endless enthusiasm. As the hour grew late, and the moon showed sympathy with a silvery glow, Mrs. Butterworth placed the final beetle wing onto her current project, a masterpiece of regality that sparkled enough to enthrall even the most somnolent of souls. She paused to admire her work, which, in truth and in the half-light of night, was beyond splendid. With a satisfied smile, she tucked Sir Fluffington into his plush basket, careful not to disturb his ears, which flicked in response to dreams of gallant adventures, a distant echo of Penelope's vibrant creativity. She whispered a soft goodnight to the flickering embers of her thoughts and blew out the candles one by one, leaving only the serene, pale glow of moonlight to accompany her to dreams. As silence caressed the night, Mrs. Penelope Butterworth, Victorian eccentric and beetle wing enthusiast, drifted into slumber, embarking now on her nightly adventure across the landscapes of imagination. And just as she settled into her dreaming voyage, A gentle tap on the window hinted at the next chapter of her ever-so-curious life. With the evening wrapped in this tender close, we transition gently into tomorrow's dawn, where the world of refined Victorian pastimes awaits us yet again to unravel the charming tales of a bygone era. In the backlit glow of early afternoon, the drawing room took on its usual air of cultivated chaos. Surrounded by floral wallpaper that schemed to outbloom itself each spring, Lady Edith reclined with the elegance of a reclined harp seal, attempting to maintain her genteel composure while navigating the treacherous waters of needlepoint. Clearly, a needle in the hand is worth 2 dropped stitches, as the old adage might have said, had Victorians been familiar with the perilous realm of improvised embroidery. You see, the genteel art of needlepoint was more than just an exercise in decorative patience. It was a strategic endeavor, akin to crossing a particularly ornery bridge in an 18th century novel. You needed a dozen pitches of fortitude for each stab of the needle, while deft fingers worked yarn into intricate furls of roses and ivy, presumably to be admired by all future lords and ducks who meandered through the parlor. Lady Edith's thoughts were elsewhere, quite contentedly considering if perhaps someone might invent stitchless embroidery one day. This wasn't to say that Lady Edith's sewing circle was entirely composed of needle-wielding artists of accidental pining for perfection. Her dear friend, the irrepressible Miss Margaret, prided herself on an embroidery style best described as avant-garde, with more emphasis on the avant than the garde. Indeed, she could make daisies, rather meteorically, resemble shooting stars. One must admire the bold creativity that allowed a bluebell to morph into the rare English pterodactyl. With moments strategically punctuated by well-timed sips of tea, strong enough to wake even the most drowsy scone, the group's conversation would flit between the censorious weather and the riddle of Lady Wickhampton's suspiciously youthful complexion, believed by some to involve a pact with a miniature band of elusive fairies. Perhaps this enchanting cup of Earl Grey could double as an anti-aging potion, sipped in volumes that might explain Lady Wickhampton's rather characteristic penchant for vigorous snoring mid-evening. This serene stage of pastel linen was a daily ritual, and one that afforded glimpses into the domestic diplomacy of a different age. For instance, why would a lady's companion, young Miss Anne, mysteriously vanish before tea time? Well, naturally because she was dispatching cleverly written complaints about the temperature of her tea to the local paper under a suitably secret pseudonym, Countess of Coolridge. Yes, the pinnacle of Victorian intrigue. Of course, discourse was not restricted to needlepoint disasters or the latest on Lady Wickhampton's affront to the natural flow of time. Often, after what might be termed the daily scandal bulletin, the room would shift to that most beguiling of 19th century mysteries, Mrs. Featherpick's never-ending novel, The Unbearably Long Story of a House in Kent. It was the type of serialized fiction devoured each month in Fiction for the Fabulously Patient, and it provided the perfect material for a spirited critique disguised as a genteel exchange of pleasantries. Curiously enough, over the languorous weave of pastels and punctuated silences, something more profound was happening. This drawing room ritual, with its bouquet of heartfelt laughter and endlessly brewing pots of tea, formed a tapestry of its own. It celebrated a slow, conversational dance that cemented alliances, forged friendships, and enshrined an understanding that, in this world of corseted propriety, laughter was as essential as well-brewed tea. Slowly, inevitably, the room drifted on the warmth of muffled chuckles, a harmonized mixture of contentment and the gentle chide against the time that threaded through their hands and minds alike. The hours mesmerically unfolded, a soft prelude to their quiet, shared existence, more comforting than any carefully stitched tapestry ever could be. And as the late afternoon sunlight streamed warm through the open windows and sparkled off polished teacups, what these noble ladies truly concentrated on was not just the fraying edges of an embroidery, but an invisible tapestry. Their interwoven stories stretched gently across the fabric of time. As the shadows began to lengthen and whisper their hints of evening promises. The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh, certain in the knowledge that tomorrow would offer another day of stitching tales and sprouting friendships. Ever so softly, it set aside its work, fully aware that the magnificence of another Victorian endeavour was yet to be explored. As the sun reluctantly began its descent beyond the smoky silhouettes of Victorian rooftops, the more genteel of London society found themselves contemplating one of the finest arts known to the refined world, the gentleman's dinner. But fear not, dear listeners. This chapter shall peel back the heavy drapes of masculinity, revealing that rich Victorian women were equally, if not more, fascinated by the allure of a grand feast, only theirs came with a far wider costume change than that of their pocket watch-wearing counterparts. Imagine, if you will, the grand almond dining room, a cavernous expanse more perfumed than a lavender field in full bloom. Here, chandeliers gleamed with all the gusto of 1,000 winking stars, though perhaps the real spectacle was Lady Chesterfield's hat, a contraption of such gargantuan whimsy that it blocked the view of her guests, who were left to marvel instead at her latest obsession, a peacock feather that doubled as a conversational centerpiece. You see, the dinner hour in those well-manicured households was a sacred ritual, replete with an orchestra of culinary delights that sputtered forth from ginger-haired scullery maids and grumbling cooks. Rich Victorian women donned the evening's most decadent gowns, materials so lustrous they practically whispered tales of faraway silkworms and distant lands as they swished through the air. Tonight's guest of honor was a practiced raconteur, one Lady Minithorpe, whose claims to fame included an indubitably thrilling account of her near brush with an alleged ghost in the Hall of Mirrors at last year's summer soiree, though, truth be told, the spectre did seem to have an extraordinary likeness to her husband's barber. While gentlemen discussed the politics of railways and the price of beef over fond views of brandy, women like Lady Minithorpe turned their attention to the subtle, yet no less competitive art of embroidery, which, contrary to popular belief, was far more than a mere pastime. Each stitch was a calculated strategic maneuver, intricately weaving the social fabric that determined one's standing in the world. Tales of continental journeys were exchanged thread by thread, each detail stitched with the precision of a diplomatic correspondence. However, let us return momentarily to the spectacle of their attire, for a rich Victorian woman's dress was more than fabric and thread. It was nothing short of a barrier to spontaneous movement, a textile fortress complete with corsets that challenged both the wearer's philosophy on breathing and her skill at stabbing peas with nary a glimpse of the plate below. Even if the treasured meal itself was perfect, ladies needed to navigate the perils of polite conversation. The perennial question, "And how is your husband these days?" was diced and served with all the politeness of a rhubarb pie, usually followed by a smile that could wither an entire conservatory of orchids were it left unchecked. Amid this opulent melee, the victuals appeared in courses as numerous and mysterious as the secrets hidden up Lady Minithorpe's lace-encrusted sleeves. Starched napkins neatly nestled onto laps like sleepy dormice. Crystal goblets shimmered with wines whose names were pronounced with varying degrees of confidence, depending largely upon the guest's familiarity with French nasal vowels. As dinner tapered to its inevitable conclusion and the haunting notes of a waltz echoed from the adjacent ballroom, rich Victorian women stood, a bustle of talent in tight-laced fashion, ready to glide forward into the night like whimsical moons orbiting an antiquated social galaxy. And so, as the evening unfurled, still wrapped in the tale of her spectral encounter, Lady Minithorpe charmed her audience once more, whilst a final tip of peacock feather bade them all a splendid adieu. As our story begins to draw toward its own conclusion, feel your eyelids grow heavy with historic dreams, knowing that amidst the satin and the shimmering chandeliers, the witty, wondrous world of Victorian wonderment will soon gather you lovingly once again. Ah, the Victorian afternoon, a time when the sun dipped gently through grand lace curtains, casting a warm, honeyed glow on the wooden floors of ornate drawing rooms. It was in these rooms that rich Victorian women would gather for that quintessentially English pastime, the afternoon tea. But before you drift off into dreamless slumber, contemplating visions of tea and crumpets, let us dive gracefully into the mosaic of rituals that adorn these well-to-do ladies' afternoons. Picture, if you will, Lady Agatha Everleigh Brampton ensconced in her velvet-upholstered armchair, her eyes dancing from the latest serialized novel by Dickens to a scandalous society magazine. With a soft exhale, she muses over the melodramas that unfold not just in the pages but within her own social sphere. One mustn't underestimate the intellectual acrobatics required to keep track of both fictional and factual intrigues, a task Lady Agatha approached with the skill of a seasoned trapeze artist. It was not all literary pursuits, however. No, indeed. As the chime of a grandfather clock marked 3:30, Lady Agatha rose with the poise of a queen, albeit a queen whose kingdom largely consisted of upholstered furniture and a particularly sassy parrot named Pickwick. Attired in her crisply structured corset and layers of flowing fabric, which must have taken an army of maids to wrangle, she proceeded to lay the groundwork for perhaps the most crucial of Victorian engagements, the social call. Visiting one's peers, or hosting them in the illustrious drawing room, was not merely an opportunity to exchange pleasantries over a fragrant cup of Earl Grey. No, it was an advanced form of covert networking, as complex and layered as the petticoats of the parties involved. Gossamer fans fluttered like the wings of ethereal butterflies, concealing whispers and subtle sideways glances. Each glance, each nuanced gesture, was steeped with portent, requiring the attendees to employ the deductive skills of Sherlock Holmes to decode. Cucumber sandwiches, scones, and the daintiest of cakes, arranged with architectural precision, awaited as the ladies arrived in a swirl of taffeta and cordial seasonal greetings. During these tête-à-tête, conversations flitted from the latest fashion faux pas of Lady Ellesmere to recent parliamentary speeches, or, heaven forbid, the scandalous disobedience of the suffragettes. Ah, the suffragettes, a spirited group of women whose boldness dared to wake even the drowsiest aristocrat from their Victorian slumber. While not all engaged with such revolutionary fervor, many a tea table whispered their shared admiration for those braving the front line of social change. Others, understandably, were more preoccupied with whether their neighbors' new curtains were French lace or simply a good domestic imitation. Such were the dichotomies of Victorian womanhood, bravery and homemaking entwined in a curious waltz through the corridors of time. As the afternoon unfolded, perhaps with a leisurely stroll through manicured gardens or a trip to the milliner for the latest in plumed headwear, the breadth of leisure available may seem decadent, indulgent even. Yet, beneath the bonneted exterior of the Victorian lady lay a mind perpetually engaged, juggling societal expectations with personal ambitions and carving out a niche within the elaborate tapestry of their world. With twilight casting its gentle embrace, the social engagements wound down, leaving our Lady Agatha in the hushed embrace of her drawing room once more. Perhaps tomorrow held the promise of a new charity event or a concert at the Grand Hall. Perhaps there would be a daring outing on the velocipede, if courage and social convention so permitted. And so, dear listener, as you nestle deeper into your cocoon of tranquility, let the soft glow of history's candlelight guide you gently into the velvety realms of sleep. Visualize elegant silhouettes moving softly against the backdrop of yesteryear, and allow the serene cadence of time to lull you ever onward toward dreams, where the stories of the past are woven into the tapestry of tranquil slumber. Dream on, for the night is young, and there are whispers of adventures left to hear. As the gentle twilight of chapter 24 gathers around us, the clock strikes the hour of snooze, ushering us into the final act of what a day in a Victorian lady's life could be. Now imagine, dear listener, the handsome grandfather clock tick-tocking away monotonously, dutifully measuring the lingering hours before bedtime. It's time for the denouement of today's adventures, where rich Victorian women, wrapped in the elegance of their gowns, transformed once more into ethereal beings of leisure as the day turned to evening. Having endured a day filled with the societal obligations such as reciting poetry, about slightly interesting vegetables, our Victorian heroine finally retreats to her well-curated boudoir, a sanctum of lace, ribbons, and what seems like an overly enthusiastic floral wallpaper. This room, resplendent with the grace of its occupant, serves as both a retreat and a theatre of contemplation. Here, whilst ensconced in a mountain of cushioned comfort, she reflects on the weighty matters of her world, like whether the butler was giving her side-eye, or if her pet parrot, Sir Flufflesworth, was truly capable of forming coherent sentences. The evening, of course, would not be complete without a soothing social engagement of the literary kind, a book club meeting, for instance. But let us not get carried away by the assumptions of sophistication. The premise of such gatherings was often to dissect the very fabric of literature like a pack of ravenous scholars, or perhaps, more accurately, as a group of cats discovering a pile of tangled yarn. This provided a splendid opportunity for our Victorian lady to express, with mild reservations, her rather unique interpretation of Lord Byron's oeuvre, which often ended with an enlightening discussion on why men should always wear more ruffles and less scornful expressions. After such intellectually muscular exercises, nourishment of a more tangible sort was needed. On this front, late evening refreshments were as integral as a lace doily on every conceivable surface. Tea flowed as freely as gossip, accompanied by the town's mightiest feats of confectionery engineering, cakes so dense they had their own gravitational pull, and biscuits that might be better employed as building materials for a more cookie-based architectural style. Sated and entertained, our subject of study would inch closer to her zenith of relaxation, the positively essential ritual of the evening toilette. This was no mere brushing of hair. It was an art form incorporating enough lotions, potions, and creams to make an alchemist swoon, a nightly attempt at transmuting oneself into a tableau of eternal youth and opulence. Curiously, the very act often led to philosophical musings on whether nature or artifice won the eternal battle of beauty. As the fervent scents of lavender and chamomile filled the chamber, our rich Victorian lady slipped into a garment of unmatched audacity, a nightdress so meticulously crafted that it could cause a scandal if worn outside one's personal quarters. But indoors, it allowed her to transcend into a vision of untroubled serenity, ready to embrace the unconscious joys of sleep. Finally, with a sigh that whispered as softly as a silk ribbon in the breeze, she relinquished the day, surrendering to the comforting embrace of her four-poster bed, a bastion of comfort where dreams were woven into the fabric with a needle made of moonbeams. Within moments, the endless machinations and complexities of Victorian life dissolved into the gentlest of slumbers. And so, dear listener, we've come to rest at the twilight of Victorian adventures, where whimsy and history entwine like the vines and roses climbing up trellises in a long-lost garden. In the gentle glow of our knowing smiles, we tuck the stories away, like a mother drawing quilted covers over a child. As you drift slowly, comfortably, through the quiet corridors of sleep, let your thoughts meander as softly as a gentle breeze across a sea of dreams. Rest easy, and may the echoes of Victorian charm cradle you into a deeper slumber. Sweet dreams, curious traveller of time,